My name is Hetfield, and I'm the president of HIAS, which, as you may know, is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And traditionally, we've been thought of as the American Jewish Community's Refugee Resettlement Agency, meaning we work to bring refugees in cooperation with communities around the country and with the U.S. government. We work to bring refugees from bad situations overseas to the United States through an orderly and safe process. But for many decades, HIAS has also been representing refugees who find their way into the United States through their own means. These are asylum seekers. And we have been doing this in New York and here in Washington, D.C. These are, just like the refugees we resettle, people who have a well-founded fear of persecution, and they have the right to protection. We've represented them in New York and Washington, but now we're looking at expanding this program to help them nationally through our network, because this is a national crisis. What's the national crisis is that asylum seekers are no longer getting the protection that they are entitled to under international law. Why is this important to the American Jewish community? The entire international system of protecting refugees really came out of the ashes of the Holocaust. The international system to protect refugees, the Refugee Convention of 1951, the U.S. asylum system, was developed to make sure that never again would people be trapped inside of a genocide with no place to flee for protection. And we're honored to be speaking here today with you, with the JCPA and the CRCs, because while HIAS, it's part of our mission to care about refugees and asylum seekers, you are a very important partner from us because you represent a much broader range of issues that are important to the Jewish community, and it's important that policymakers hear from us, that our communities hear from us, that this is an issue that is important to the Jewish community because it really is steeped so deeply in our roots and in our values. Now, we're going to first, I'll introduce the three panelists, and I want to let you know that at the end of this, we will be taking questions. There are index cards on the table, so if you can pass up index cards, they'll be collected. We'll take questions at the end. Tammy is collecting those. Joining me is Brane from UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, or the UN Refugee Agency. The UNHCR is the international organization that is charged with protecting refugees and finding durable solutions around the world. She is at the regional office for Washington, for the United States and the Caribbean, here in Washington, D.C. And Anna has a lot of experience in the Western Hemisphere, having worked in the Mexico City office, regional office of UNHCR, and also in Guatemala City for UNHCR. We're also joined by Scott Shuchart from the Center for American Progress, also known as CAP. And he's the Senior Immigration Fellow there, and from 2010 to 2018, Scott was at the Department of Homeland Security, working on immigration enforcement, border, detention, and civil rights issues. And then finally, we are joined by Michelle Brane from the Women's Refugee Commission. And Michelle has a long resume, but is without a doubt one of the experts on, one of the greatest national experts we have on detention policy of immigrants, immigrant families, and immigrant children here in the United States. So I'm going to start with Anna. Anna, can you explain to us what is the role of UNHCR, what's the role of your office, and how does it see the current situation at the border?
Sure. So the role of UNHCR globally, we are the agency which is supposed to supervise state parties to the 1951 Refugee Convention and ensure and support them to ensure that they respect the rights of refugees in the treaty, in the 1951 Convention and the 1967 Protocol. And the U.S. is a signatory to the 67 Protocol, and so has acquired all of those obligations. Our role throughout the world is to deliver and to also coordinate the delivery of humanitarian assistance, not only food and shelter and psychosocial assistance, etc., but also legal aid and ensuring that refugees, asylum seekers arriving to countries have access to territory and also have access to the assistance they need to apply for asylum. We work in many countries. We actually adjudicate refugee claims themselves, where countries do not have the capacity or the willingness to adjudicate refugee status. So in those countries, our officials actually go through that process of determining who is a refugee and who is deserving and needy of that protection. We also work very, very closely with civil society on durable solutions. Mark mentioned this term. This means essentially, how does an individual stop becoming a refugee? Are they able to return safely and in dignified conditions to their home country? Or in many instances, in most instances in the past several decades, that's not been possible. Are they either able to locally integrate permanently in the country where they found refuge, or in some instances, do they need to be resettled to a third country? And so UNHCR works very closely with around 20 countries around the world to resettle refugees permanently. And we work with civil society organizations, including HIAS, here in the United States, to resettle individuals to other countries, including to the United States. Last but not least, we are the organization which sets the global legal standards for how one interprets the rights that are set out in the body of the treaty, which sets out the refugee definition, and we set the legal standards for how that definition is interpreted. So in terms of guiding states on what constitutes persecution and how the refugee definition should be interpreted, we set the global standards for that. And when necessary, we find ourselves in a position, as we have this year in the U.S., to have to engage in strategic litigation when states simply get it wrong. So to go to Mark's later question, how do we see the situation in the U.S.? Well, as Mark mentioned, we are a regional office. My team here in Washington has responsibility for protection of refugees in the United States, but also in around 28 or 29 states of the Caribbean. I would say we're not going to get into the Caribbean too much, but I just want to thank and acknowledge HIAS for being the only American partner that has stepped up in the Caribbean to help us cope with the Venezuela refugee situation, which is impacting the Southern Caribbean states and territories. So thank you for that. But for here in the United States, we have been watching and engaging with increasing concern what has been happening at the U.S. border, not only in terms of individuals and how they are treated upon arrival and sort of the lack of reception capacity, the lack of a coordinated plan for coping with the situation that's been unfolding on the border, but also with the simple ability for individuals to access U.S. territory, and I believe Michelle is going to speak more about that. But I want to point out, I pulled up some figures from a New York Times article this morning just to remind myself of the numbers. Mark mentioned the word crisis, and indeed, if you are to read the papers and you read the statements that you hear on a daily basis from the administration, one would think that we had record numbers of individuals arriving to the southern border. In fact, the total number of individuals arriving on a daily, weekly, monthly basis to the southern border today are far, far lower than they were a decade or 2 decades ago. The numbers that I pulled up from the New York Times this morning, last year in 2018, monthly arrivals varied between 10 and 20,000 people per month, whereas in the year 2000, the lowest monthly arrivals were 71,000 a month, and the highest month on record in 2000 were 220,000 people per month. So the numbers that we're facing at the southern border today, I would not call them a crisis. What is the crisis is the failure to respond appropriately to those. And as we've had this huge shift in numbers, let's say from a high of 220,000 in 2000 to a high of 40,000 a month this last year. What has really changed? Well, it's not just the numbers, it's also who is arriving. If you looked at the average Central American migrant who arrived in 2000, it's possible they might have been fleeing the effects of Hurricane Mitch. It's possible that but the most likely scenario was that they were fleeing from economic deprivation. Whereas today, 18 years later, the vast majority of people fleeing from what we call the NCA region, the Northern Triangle of Central America, are fleeing, they're fleeing persecution and violence, essentially, as transnational gangs and street gangs have taken over entire swaths of their communities. And they're no longer able to live safely, no longer able to send their children to school, no longer able to guarantee that their children won't be forcibly recruited or that their daughters won't be forced to become a gang girlfriend. So you have a tremendous change in the demographic of individuals who are coming. Most individuals are no longer coming for predominantly economic reasons. They're coming predominantly because it's too violent to stay at home. And so, in order to not go on forever, we all could talk about these things forever, I think, just to say that, the real crisis is the way that these individuals are arriving and being treated. And so we've been working closely with NGO partners to try to figure out how to change the situation. Unfortunately, part of what we've had to recur to here in the United States is really to focus on supporting through strategic litigation, because the courts really have been the only thing between us and even worse things happening. So I'll leave it there.
And let me just ask one more thing on that. To what extent does U.S. policy and action on this issue have an impact on other countries?
Oh, certainly. It has a huge impact. UNHCR officials around the globe can tell you that they have conversations on a regular basis with governments who are facing far more numbers at their borders than ours. Countries like Jordan, countries like Kenya, countries like Pakistan, who are supporting infinitely, exponentially more refugees in their territory than we are, who will just frankly say, why should we keep our borders open when the United States doesn't? Why should we support more refugees when the U.S. is lowering its resettlement numbers? This resonates. It does not go without notice, and it resonates very clearly. It's not just something that we suppose is in the minds of officials. It's something that we hear from officials around the country on a daily basis.
Thanks. Scott, how would you describe the situation along the border now? How has it changed since you were in government?
Thanks, Mark. The situation, I think I entirely agree, is to the extent that it's a crisis, it is largely a policy crisis related to decisions that people are making in Washington and the agencies along the border. There's more or less continuity in the underlying situation since about 2014, when the number of people who are coming from the Northern Triangle, women and children seeking protection, really began to escalate. And I think the underlying situation is mostly one of continuity and a change in our response. To contextualize a little bit the whole of the legal immigration problem as it's articulated, there is general consensus that the number of people who are here without legal permission is around 11 million. It probably peaked around 12 million a couple of years ago. It's probably between 10 and 11 million now. Half or more of those people, one estimate is as high as 80% of those people have been here for more than 10 years. So I'd like to say that people's understanding of the illegal or undocumented immigration problem is often frozen around the time of the president's second marriage, when people who were coming were largely working age men, largely from Mexico, coming into a low-skilled labor market that was seeking their labor. That situation has really substantially shifted towards this refugee population, and that means that the stock of people who are here without permission is largely people who came some time ago, put down roots, and had families. Of the people who are coming now, who in a given year become a part of the undocumented population, half of those don't come across the border at all. They're overstays of people who come with legal permission, as with a visa or visa waiver, and stay beyond the terms of that. And that's a fairly transient population. And then of that 11 million, there's, depending on how you count, 1 million or 2 million who would be eligible to regularize their status under something like the Dream or Protection Act, depending on which version you look at. So thinking of the undocumented population as 11 million people who just walked across the border is really not the right way to think about it at all. Think of it as about half who've been here for some period of time, about half who've been here for a shorter period of time, many of them as overstays, not as a southern border problem at all. What is the situation physically at the southern border? Is it a situation where there are drugs streaming in? I have to do a little bit of vocabulary, which is the legal crossing points are all called ports of entry. They're not a port in the sense necessarily of a place that a ship pulls up, but that's a place where there's a bridge or a checkpoint or some place that CBP is present, or an airport is a port of entry, where CBP is present to admit people legally. In between the ports of entry is where the Border Patrol patrols. That's where, if you were to build a wall, I suppose you would build it, because the ports of entry, by definition, are places you have lanes of traffic coming through. So according to the 2018 DEA drug assessment, the most common method employed for drugs to come in is, quote, transporting illicit drugs through U.S. ports of entry in passenger vehicles. That's where drugs come in now. Beyond that, some come by sea. A very small number come, with somebody with a backpack walking through the desert between a port of entry, or occasionally now being carried by a drone. And so the border security situation is not one of large amounts of drugs being brought physically over the border. There is a problem with tunnels in some places along the border where drugs and people can come in underground, but I'm not familiar with a wall that would go underground. And I've really explained very clearly who the people are who are coming, who are being apprehended, and so I won't get into the demographic details as much. And then there's a question of whether there's a crime problem at the southern border, coming through the southern border, and I know the acting attorney general said that all crime comes through the southern border the other day in his testimony. I'm not clear how that could be the case, but in any event, all the studies that I am familiar with are that immigrants commit crimes at a much, much lower rate than native-born Americans, even undocumented immigrants at about half the rate of native-born Americans. And so, obviously, if you're 50 feet from the border, the likelihood that somebody who is a pickpocket is more likely to be, you can tweak the numbers in ways to create something, but overall, this is a Cato Institute study of Texas that I think is the best numbers. Overall, our understanding is that undocumented immigrants are not a significant source, and certainly not a differential source of crime, really, in any community or in any part of the country. But, as we discussed, there's a perception of, or there have been efforts to try to treat these relatively consistent or diminishing problems as a crisis. And there have been a lot of policy changes, but I want to go back to 2014, when the population of women and children from the Northern Triangle really became a much larger part. In the Northern Triangle, of the people who were caught between the ports of entry, in 2007, 7% of them were from Central America. It's now 53%. So the overall numbers are down, but the share that is not Mexican, that is from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador is much larger. The Obama administration treated that as something of a crisis of what the immigration system was going to do about a very different population of young children and families who are seeking protection. They created family detention facilities in Texas, briefly one in New Mexico, that still exist, but due to some court interpretations of a legal settlement that was entered into during the Clinton administration, those family detention facilities only hold families now for about 3 weeks. So though they were not intended that way, they now function essentially as a processing center. But the Obama administration response initiative was to try to do long-term detention of families. There was essentially a marketing campaign, which I think still exists into Central America, to talk about the dangers of the journey, to warn people not to let their children migrate because of the violence and physical risks along the way. There was a program called the Central American Minors Program, which was an attempt to have a refugee response rather than an asylum response, and have people be interviewed and processed from Central America. And there was something I'll talk about briefly called the Family Case Management Program, which was an intensive kind of like social work model for handling families so that when they were not detained, they were getting community support services and supervision to ensure that they continued to attend court hearings. In the Trump administration, the Central American Minors Program was discontinued. The Family Case Management Program was discontinued. There's been an effort to change the court ruling that limits family detention to 21 days, and there's currently an attempt at a regulation that would again allow for indefinite detention of families in these basically jail-like facilities that are run by the immigration agencies. And then there was the family separation policy, that the administration continues to say is not the family separation policy from 2017, and then particularly during the period in the spring of 2018, which was ended through a combination of court orders and executive action, although we still believe that the rate at which children are separated from their families is much higher now than it was 2 or 3 years ago, with the children going into the unaccompanied children detention process and the parents into the adult detention process. There was an attempt to prohibit people who crossed between the ports of entry from seeking asylum at all, which was stopped instantly by the courts because the statute literally says people may apply for asylum whether or not at a port of entry. But there was another presidential proclamation the other day to try to advance that policy. And so if it were ultimately upheld by the courts, that would be an enormous change in the policy response to just not allow people to seek asylum when they go across the border, which, as Mark says, is essentially the World War II inheritance of our asylum system. And then there have been some efforts to change substantive asylum law to limit the ability of people whose claims relate to gang violence, domestic violence, or family-based claims to seek protection at all. And a number of those are still pending in the courts. For example, the district court enjoined the Justice Department's attempt to change the definition of asylum to rule out most domestic violence cases. And then there are things that are happening. So if the attempt is to funnel people to cross at the legal ports of entry and seek asylum there, you might think that the administration would add resources to process people. But they've done the reverse. They've created something called metering, where officers stand on the bridge and limit the number of people who are allowed to come through at all. And so the number of asylum seekers who are being processed at the legal ports is way down. And then there's a new policy called, I can't even say it, Migrant Protection Protocols, but it's called the Remain in Mexico program, where even once people are metered and go through an initial interview, they are turned back around and told to wait in Mexico for the months that their case is being processed. I'll talk briefly also about changes to the refugee program. The refugee program operates under an annual cap that the State Department articulates about how many refugees will be allowed in. The administration's stated view is that because there are so many asylum claims coming through the southern border, that's a reason to reduce the number of refugees who are resettled. So the official cap has dropped from usually 80,000, 70,000, briefly a high of 110,000. It has now dropped this year to 30,000. But they are currently on pace to only admit about 9,000. Only 3,000 refugees have been admitted as of a week ago. This entire year out of the cap, it's supposed to be 30,000 principal refugees. And then there was the Muslim travel ban, which has sharply limited the number of people who are allowed to come in from certain countries. So the policy response has been really quite dramatic. And I'll just take one more minute to say there are a lot of different policy responses we could have, right? Bringing back in-country processing, the Central American Minors Program, or something larger than that. Having additional attorneys and judges and resources to adjudicate cases efficiently but fairly. I don't know if people realize, but there's no counsel provided to people who are in the immigration system, no matter what their need, except for some very small programs for particular kinds of children. Increasing the family case management program and ending family detention, having a safer system for treating people when they are apprehended if they cross through the desert, having medical care and so forth. And then just the general plea that policy making be built around what the problem really is and what would be legal rather than issuing policies that are instantly enjoined, that are not able to be effective, that aren't aimed at the problem we really have. And that's the box in which I think a lot of other detailed solutions could be built, but that I would not be thinking about.
Thanks, Scott. It is ironic that this administration claims to value legal immigration, and yet they ended the only legal way that Central American minors could come to this country to reunite with their families. And now, once again, they have to risk their lives to cross the desert if they want to accomplish that through extra legal means. Michelle, what happens to these asylum seekers after they get here?
Well, so I'm going to actually backtrack a little bit to ease into that question, just to overlap on some of what Anna and Scott said. What we've seen really, as they both said, is a change in the demographic who's come to the border, right? The numbers are lower, but we have a higher percentage, not only of asylum seekers among those people who are arriving at the border, as opposed to people coming to work, but also a much higher percentage of those people are women and children or family units, right? Families coming together, which shouldn't be a surprise if you're talking about more asylum seekers coming, right? If people are fleeing, it's less likely that it's going to be single men alone coming to work, and much more likely that people are going to bring their children and bring their whole families, because they're fleeing something that's a threat to the whole family, not just one. And so what we really have been faced with over these years is trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, so to speak, right? We have not changed or adapted the policies for screening and processing people at the border to who those people are. And instead, what we've really seen is almost a panicked effort to say too many people, this very system that was created for this very population, once the numbers started coming, there's this panic reaction that there must be something wrong with the system. And that's where you hear this administration in particular talk about loopholes and people taking advantage of the system. What they're really doing is actually using the system for exactly what it was created, right? To reach safety and access an asylum protection system. So the response has been really one of figuring out how to stop people from doing that. And that has included some efforts that are, messages in home country, reducing the refugee program, and that sort of thing, but also creating any kind of deterrence that they can think of. And one of the main deterrent factors that's been traditionally a fallback for many administrations, but in particular for this administration, is detention. And so detention really becomes a form of punishment and a form of discouraging people from using or trying to access the asylum system. And that's where we see things like family separation, right? This concept of literally saying to families when they arrived, if you're going to seek asylum, we are going to separate you. And, there's now a lot of evidence coming out from what we knew from the beginning of this when it was being discussed as a policy that one of the main intentions of that was to deter people from seeking asylum and coming north. So what happens when a person comes to the border? Well, these days, as you've heard from both Scott and Anna, it's quite difficult to actually get in, whether you're coming, especially if you're coming through a port of entry and you're trying to come the way they say you're supposed to come, right? So you come and present yourself to a port of entry now, and almost all of the ports along the southern border will say to you, no, you cannot come in now, you have to get in line, or you have to get on the list, or we're only taking 10 people today, or 30 people, or what they've decided for the day. But there's no formal process for them getting in that line. So just to give you an example of what we saw when we were down in Tijuana, which you hear a lot about, right, is that people get to the border, they're told to go away and get in line. There's no official line to get in, but there is a list being kept by migrants themselves. And there's some confusion about how involved the Mexican government is in sort of maintaining that list and allowing people from that list to get to the actual port. But the critical piece here is that it is just a group of random people keeping this list. There is huge potential, and in fact, we've actually seen evidence of exploitation, right, to get on that list. You can only imagine desperate people trying to get on a list and what they're willing to do or what others are willing to do to put them on that list. And children in particular, unaccompanied children. We've always had a segment of the group of people arriving at the border as unaccompanied children under 18 who are coming either on their own fleeing violence or to join family members. Unaccompanied children have no access to that list. So they are really put in this shocking catch-22 by the US government and the Mexican government in which they literally cannot approach a border and ask for asylum the way they have a legal right to do, both by US law and international law, and are forced to look for other ways, right? So we're literally forcing those kids, just like other people who are sitting at the port and don't want to wait in dangerous circumstances to access protection, to look for other more dangerous ways. And I find this particularly ironic with this president who talks a lot about how we need to build a wall in order to protect women and children from trafficking, right? Because the policies that they're implementing are literally driving kids and women and others into the hands of smugglers and potential traffickers. And we're seeing this play out along the entire border. But let's say you do get through. Many people do cross between those ports of entry, and literally, I would say that 80% of the people I talk to in detention tell me that they couldn't get into the port, or were told they wouldn't get into the port, went between a port of entry and then walked to the port of entry on the US side to turn themselves in. Again, so this image of people running across and trying to sneak in is again sort of a misconception, because primarily what we've been hearing, and this may shift because of how policies are moving, right, is that people turn themselves in when they get to the other side of the border. So depending on who and where you are, you generally automatically are detained. And you'll hear a lot about the galeras or the ice boxes. Those are references that migrants have given, names migrants have given to the Border Patrol or the CBP facilities in which they are held in those first few days of apprehension. They're kept very cold. That is intentional. And they're also very often people who are coming in wet, right, after walking through a desert, crossing a river, and they're thrown into these very highly air-conditioned centers. They're not intended to be ice boxes, but that's the name that it was given. And they are cold. I'm in them all the time, and I'm always cold, and I always take extra sweaters with me. From there, they're screened, and if they're asking for asylum, you're still automatically detained. The detention centers that people are sent to are basically prisons. It's important to remember that. They're often referred to differently by the government. But they are physically like prisons. Very often they are actual prisons or a wing of a prison or a county jail. There are a lot of different ways that these are contracted. Sometimes they're directly contracted with counties where they will either use a former prison or a part of a prison. And then very often with private prison companies who also run prisons, and they don't run them really any differently than they run the immigration facilities. And a few are run by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement themselves. It used to be, and under law, once you pass this initial threshold that you have an asylum case, called the credible fear interview, you get transferred out of what's called expedited removal, apologies for the technical terms, but into a process where you're going to go in front of a judge to present your case for asylum. And at that point, generally, you are eligible, in theory, and under the law, to be paroled, which means that you can be released from detention in order to pursue your case. And why is this important, other than, space? Well, access to attorneys is extremely difficult in immigration facilities. Scott already mentioned that there is no sort of automatic access to an attorney or legal right to an attorney. You have a legal right to an attorney in immigration proceedings, but at your own expense. And what that means is that over 80% of asylum seekers in detention do not have an attorney, cannot access an attorney. It is also difficult once you're out of custody, but it's much easier at that point, right? Conditions in the facilities are problematic. There are standards, they're often not met. I routinely visit immigration detention centers around the country, and rarely have I visited, in fact, I don't think I've ever visited a facility where I haven't found some violation of the standard. And even if you are complying with all the standards, it's still prison. And you've got to remember that these people they're seeking protection. They've often been traumatized. They're at this point separated from family and from people who can help them with their case. And again, we see really serious mental health consequences of being detained, but also really serious physical health consequences. And the medical treatment that is received is often inadequate. So I have seen a number and spoken to numerous cases of women having miscarriages in detention, of being really threatened with detention and you having to have your baby in detention unless you sign these papers to leave now. People are consistently told that their medical complaints or issues are not serious and that they have to wait. And we've seen people die, and we've seen suicides. So conditions are not good. Getting out is important, especially if you're an asylum seeker. What we've seen under this administration is virtually an end to this possibility of parole. So today, if you reach the U.S. border, you get through the border, you get into custody, and you say you want to apply for asylum, you pass this initial threshold for an asylum claim, it is likely that you will remain in custody throughout throughout your proceedings, or at least for a very long time. Currently, that can be years, really. The dockets are really, really backlogged. If you're released right now, the docket's going to give you a hearing for almost 5 years out. Problematic for anyone, whether they have a case or not. It's really hard to live your life in limbo, waiting for a case and a court date 5 years from now. Even remembering, frankly, a court date 5 years from now would be difficult for somebody like me. So that's why these programs like the Family Case Management Program are really important. I mean, I'm skipping sort of some of the subtleties of families and how they fit in with others. Families, as Scott mentioned, because of this litigation, cannot be held at a family detention center for more than about a month, 3 weeks to a month. That is because the current family detention facilities, they like to call them residential centers, don't meet legal standards. Under current legal standards, they must, if you're going to detain a child, it must be in a licensed, non-secure facility. And that's basically in order to meet child welfare standards in this country and internationally. They do not meet those standards, and so they have to release them. And this is where we ended up with this mess of family separation, as what the administration saw as the only solution, because they eliminated what is an obvious alternative that could exist for people, whether they're families or not, right? We have seen that families in particular who are seeking asylum, even when released, and even if they don't have a lawyer, almost always show up for their hearings. Why wouldn't they, right? If they think they have a case and a claim for protection, and this is going to be a way for them to access status in the United States, they have incentive to show up. And over 90% of families over a 15-year period, even without an attorney, showed up. If they had an attorney, they were 96% of them showed up. And if they were in this family case management program, which gave them additional support and guidance and reminders of their hearings and assistance in getting an attorney, 99% showed up for their hearings and all appointments. And in fact, in that program, it was not long enough to really show cases go to their completion because the administration cut it off. But 2 families under that program did get final orders of removal in which they were not granted asylum, and both of those families left the country under the program. So it was an extremely successful program, but was terminated just as the policy of family separation was implemented. As was this program for bringing kids through a more refugee processing type process where they wouldn't have to cross the desert on their own. So these are just examples of how we're really looking at a policy and policies from all angles that are really intended to create chaos and sort of dismantle the system that we have in place instead of making adjustments to address the different population that we have coming to the border. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm sure you guys have questions, and I want to leave some time for that.
Thanks. Thanks, Michelle. Do we have questions, Tammy?
Raise your hand and I will come collect your cards.
Tammy, behind.
And then there will be some afternoon sessions on immigration and advocacy to follow this up. For the 3 of you, if you could have a one-on-one meeting with Stephen Miller, would you? Grandson of Turkish refugees, what would you ask him and what 3 things would you want to tell him? Try to be quick. Anna, we'll start with you, UN representative that you are.
Well, this would be, obviously our approach would be perhaps a little bit different as a UN agency. Oh, that is a tough question. I think I want to use the opportunity to allude to a point that I wanted to make earlier, which is that our current system is under incredible strain at the southern border because we do not have an appropriate reception model set up. There are countries around the world who receive much higher volumes of asylum seekers, refugees, and plain old garden variety immigrants every year that have developed reception capacity that actually is both humanitarian and efficient in terms of distinguishing between people who need protection and those who don't, and making sure they get it. So I guess probably one of the conversations I'd like to initiate with Mr. Miller, if I have the opportunity, would be around, with the current situation we have with the lack of reception capacity, how does this administration view moving forward when we have a massive crisis with Venezuelans on our hands? We have, by the end of this year, we will have 5 million Venezuelans who've fled their country, and it is only a matter of time before we start seeing new populations, not just the continued flow of refugees from the northern triangle of Central America, but we've also, we will start seeing in the coming months and years more and more Venezuelans approaching our borders as well. And so, really, what is the plan to cope with this situation in a more humane manner? Because if we think the situation is bad now, let's wait a few years down the line when we start seeing desperate Venezuelans who used all of their coping mechanisms where they are, whether that's Peru or in Suriname or in Ecuador, and they start moving north to try to find a better solution. So I would perhaps use that opportunity just to put up a warning call that the situation can only get much worse given how complex displacement is right now in the Western Hemisphere.
I think my question would be, if I could get a straight answer, what problem are you trying to solve? I don't think there's been a good faith articulation of real problems that the things this administration is trying to do would address. And there are real problems. 5 years is not an appropriate processing time for somebody who needs an answer as to what their family status is going to be. But that's not a problem that we're solving. And so if I could have a real conversation in good faith, it would be to try to get onto the table what actually is worth addressing, that could be addressed, and why and how.
So the daughter of 2 mental health professionals in me wants to say I would want to ask him questions that get at what happened to him. And I say that in all seriousness. I mean, it's sort of a joke, but really, I think that there's something else going on in his motivations for the policies that he promotes. And I say this not only because I work at the Women's Refugee Commission, which focuses on women and children and families, but there does seem to be a specific targeting of these vulnerable populations in the policies that he is pushing forward. And they do tend to be, they really seem to me focused on punishing and suffering. And so I'm sort of curious as to where that comes from. And in part that's because I'm interested in getting, in some ways, at what Scott is saying, is what is the problem he's trying to address and how can we work to either figure out a way that works or combat it, I don't know. So I'm going to start with those things, and I'm just going to leave it there because I know there's other questions and I can't add much more. I don't think we've got very far,
right.
I guess, is my point.
Right. Thank you. And here, I heard a rumor that HIAS may be decertified by the Trump administration as a resettlement agency. Is this accurate? There have been 9 national refugee resettlement agencies, 6 of them faith-based, 1 of them Jewish, which is HIAS, since this system was established in 1980 by President Carter. And it's been, as I said, it's been 9 since then. But yes, the Trump administration has said, since there are so few refugees coming in, we have too many agencies, so we want to eliminate 1 or more of them. They were planning on doing that for this year, for 2019, but it took them more than a quarter to get to a point where they could make a decision, so they gave us a stay of execution. But yes, once again, we are HIAS and the other 8 agencies are at risk of being cut out of the refugee program so that the Jewish community or the Lutheran community or whatever community they decide to cut will no longer have a role in welcoming refugees. So we will need your help in a few months' time when that decision is yet again going to be made, and that will be made over the summer. So yeah, that is not a rumor, that is true. I heard that in San Diego, ICE is literally dumping people on streets. Can you comment on this? And I will say, Jewish Family Service of San Diego is right now working in Jewish Family Service of San Diego is an affiliate of HIAS in our resettlement network, but they are also working right now as part of an interfaith coalition and basically running a migrant shelter, working with the state of California. Anyone care to comment on San Diego and whether or not ICE is dumping people on the streets?
I mean, I'll say something. I think one of the misconceptions, and it's a complicated situation at our border, right? And our system just clearly isn't really working. There is an assumption sometimes that ICE detains everybody indefinitely. They don't have space, right? I mean, one of the things I actually didn't say when I was speaking about detention is the increase in detention space. You know, in 2000 or before 2000, we had less than 10,000 people in immigration custody on any given day, even though the number of arriving people was in the millions. It was much higher than it is now, right? We had 1.6 million people or more every year being apprehended at the border, and only 10,000 bed spaces for them. We now have over 40,000 people sitting in immigration detention on any given day, 45,000 about, right?
We had 49.
Yes, at one point, yes, that's right. It's gone up to almost 50,000, right? But they only have money for way less than that. So that's a whole other issue, right? But the clear thing is that detention has gone up, but there still is no capacity, even close, to detain everybody. And we don't need to detain everybody. I mean, I think that's the important thing here. And it's related to this border question because what happens is, there are a lot of ways to ensure people show up for hearings. I already pointed out how asylum seekers do show up. You don't need to have them in detention. But always there's been some that they cannot detain. What we do not have now is a logical system for deciding who and how, right? We don't have any system for that. So it's very random. It's based on whether there's space or not. And when there's not space, what has traditionally happened is you get a notice to appear, you're given a hearing date or an appointment, and are told to come back on that date and released. With children who are unaccompanied, they have to go to the ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, because obviously, as you can imagine, it can't be just releasing children onto the street without any care, right? And that's a different process, and they find their families or sponsors. But for adults, that's generally what happens. And with families, that's generally what happens if there's no space in family detention. But with families, it's a little bit more complicated, and when people are really vulnerable, it can get more complicated. Traditionally, what has been happening at Customs and Border Protection is that they have a system in which they give people a few days and they will drop them off at a bus station. People have a place to go, or have a plan, right? You don't just come to the border without a plan. They have a plan, they're trying to get someplace. And so they used to facilitate somewhat people getting to those locations so they could move on with their case and show up at that hearing that they had to show up at. What we've been seeing happening now is sort of holding on to people and then just dumping them on street corners and not doing that step of facilitating people getting to where they need to go. And this has caused log jams. And again, we have a population that is more vulnerable. You have small children, you have people in really poor health because they've been traveling in really dire circumstances. And so, luckily, in many of these places, communities have stepped up to provide that step and that assistance of getting people to where they're going, and HIAS is one of them. But it's happening all along the border, and particularly in places where the highest concentration of families are.
I never get to say this, but it's even worse than that. So this uncontrolled release policy was started in October, and it is my understanding, and certainly my belief, that it was something to make things look worse before the election. Right? There was no need for it. There wasn't a surge that ICE suddenly was incapable of handling by taking people to the bus station. And then a caravan came along, and it ended up not being needed as a headline story. But that was when it started, and I'm sure that that's why.
They decided to make it more difficult.
Yeah.
Now, there's a number of questions here regarding how hopeless things are at the federal government level, at the executive branch in particular. And here's a good question, especially for this crowd, for the CRCs, the Community Relation Councils. Given those limitations, is there anything that can be done at the state level vis-a-vis any of these issues in inequality? positive way.
I think there's a tremendous amount that can be done at the state and local level. I mean, just listening to you both describe, the dumping of people. I mean, what is so striking to me about the United States, and of course, I'm an American, but I've spent the vast majority of my career working on refugee situations in other countries. And so coming back to my own and seeing how our own immigration system processes asylum seekers is quite startling. In part, when you are overseas and you have a decent refugee response, and oftentimes in these, in less developed countries, UNHCR is really coordinating that response. In the best of times, you have a very coordinated effort that creates a framework of cooperation between the state, UN agencies, if they're there to support, and civil society groups, and the local jurisdictions where individuals are, whether that's the provincial level or the city level, etc. And what we have here is a lack of any system. I mean, in an ideal world, the authorities at the border would drop individuals off in a structured manner with NGO partners, let's say San Diego and the Jewish Family Services Shelter, which was stood up about 6 months ago in San Diego, for respite, for care, for immediate interventions, whether it's psychosocial interventions or medical interventions or helping pregnant women or managing any type of communicable disease that an individual might arrive with. And then you would have some organized fashion where people would be onwardly moved to their final destination, and they would be received in that location, and they would then start to focus on what are your longer term needs, what is your need for legal aid, which of you do we need to triage to get to the best immigration lawyer for your case, et cetera, et cetera. This simply doesn't happen. In San Diego, for example, they do, the JFS did stand up the shelter. I actually visited it last week, and it was probably the best respite shelter I've seen in the United States, and it was stood up in 6 months' time. And part of the reason it is so well run is because the state of California sent experts in, technical advisors, to support with a wide range of systems in there. And not only was JFS working to set up the shelter, but they brought in other partners. They brought in other local NGOs who were able to send case managers and support them, etc. So I think if you had state and local governments engaging and you had civil society partners and you were able to sit down with the feds and say, let's structure a response, we could have infinitely better responses than we have today, but there is no mechanism for coordinating. These respite shelters, maybe they have a really friendly government official who calls them, lets them know we're dumping people at the bus station, and then the NGOs scurry to get them. But it doesn't have to be this way. It can be organized. And civil society can play a very protagonistic role there if space is provided to them to do what they do best. So I would say, the sky's the limit. It's just a question of breaking through the situation that we're in now.
And I'll give 3 other examples. Some states and localities are now funding counsel for people in immigration cases. There's a big project in New York, the projects in California. The federal government isn't paying for lawyers, but states and localities can. Some school systems have a lot of immigrant refugee kids coming in. Some have handled that better than others, been better resourced for it than others, done the community notification and support in keeping people from getting the wrong idea. Others have done less well. And so having community support for kids who are coming into the community, in particular coming into the school system, maybe with English language needs and other things, is very important. And then a third thing, based on my experience in government, is if the government at some point starts to have better facilities that it needs to build, things that are more like halfway houses, things that are more like school support shelters for children, communities need to have a way of being welcoming of that. And those are going to go to communities that have a good civil society and government infrastructure that are able to make them work, and there need to be communities around the country that will work ultimately with the federal government to create more in-community housing situations, both for children and for refugees.
Yeah, exactly what they said. I agree 100%. And I would just say that I think that there's enormous potential for that in this country. I mean, just seeing the response of communities and local governments to the family separation crisis, I guess, or whatever you want to call it, I think it made it very clear that there are many, many communities and many, many local governments who want to step up and do something and just need a way to do it. And I think a lot of this is coordination.
Thank you. We have a lot more good questions, but no more time. So I will pass this on to the immigration panels that will be later today. And Michael Hopkins, the director of executive director of the JFS in San Diego, will be on those panels, so he can also follow up at that time. Thank you so much for coming.